The important thing is the food system, what is going out to 300 million Americans, and that is why even if in our own personal choices we need to think about this stuff, it's very important to try to change the system, because the system is fun. If people are getting horrible food as a matter of course, then the system needs to change. We need to fight back.
I get excited and energized by seeing, and there's two things. It's seeing on the ground this thing that I write about, these massive monocrops of two crops, corn and soybeans, that gigantic, enormous feedlots, CAFOs, smelling them. All that is something that I need to see since I write about it. But what really gets me is the energy to push back against it. So that's how I wanted to begin, by saying thank you so much for inviting me here and having me. What we're talking about here are these extremely consolidated markets. There are a couple of deals. I guess the Dow-DuPont deal has been officially approved. I think the Monsanto-Bayer deal is inevitable. And when that happens, you're going to have three companies that dominate 70%, upwards of 70% of the, not US and not GMO seeds, but the global seed market, not just for GMOs, but for all seeds, and a similar proportion of pesticides. And so it gives these companies a very strong economic interest in maintaining the status quo, and it also gives them a lot of profits to capture. And as I said before, they are, I think, very smart in understanding media and how media works, and so they create narratives. And creating narratives is for them, is sort of like fertilizing the field, fertilizing public opinion with the idea that their way of doing things is the only way of doing things. And if we don't do things like this, then people are going to starve. The three dominant themes, I think, are that biotech and enormous CAFOs are necessary. And when I say biotech, I mean the sort of whole package that goes along with it. Seeds engineered to withstand herbicides, seeds that create their own pesticides, all of that sort of as a package. These are necessary to feed the 9 billion. And if you don't support them, and if you don't believe in them, then you want people to starve. You want the poor to starve. That's one of the dominant themes. The second one, I think, has been also really powerful, and that is that scientific agriculture, applying science to agriculture, results in that system that I just mentioned. And then the third one, we'll get to why this happened. This narrowing of the debate that happened, I would put it around 2013, that narrowing the debate, hyper-focusing on whether you're going to kill over dead if you eat a kernel of GMO corn, and if that's not going to happen, then what's the problem? Then debate is over. These tropes, these ideas, they get out in the universe, and they become, editors read them. The people that make decisions on what's going to be published, how it's going to be published, how it's going to be edited, read these things, and they exert a powerful influence. Just today, someone handed me a piece from the Des Moines Register. It's an op-ed, and it's a woman talking about how we need high-tech research in agriculture. We need more state funding for. We need sort of the state apparatus to put money into subsidizing these companies by funding their research. And she says in her lead, agriculture accounts for 1/3 of the dollars driving Iowa's economy, helping to feed Iowans, Americans, and millions more around the world. I mean, this is sort of out there every day in the ether. And of course, it's sort of not true that it's even feeding Iowans, because the corn and soybeans get shifted into CAFOs, fed to pork and pigs, and shipped out of the state for processing, and then maybe come back later. But it's not generating, it's not really feeding Iowa. It's not staying in Iowa. The second one, I think, this one is extremely powerful and seductive for editors. And the reason why this one is so powerful is because we're living in an era of climate change denialism taken root and taken power. So it's now the official policy of the land to deny climate change. And so it's an extremely powerful idea that if you can equate biotech agriculture and CAFOs with science, and anyone who questions them, if they can be painted as anti-science, then that gives editors pause. In the early years of this decade, the paradigm of CAFOs and biotech agriculture started to come apart. In terms of biotech, basically after 20 years of commercialization, there were two products in fields, two products in the world, in the United States and elsewhere, and they were herbicide-tolerant seeds and BT seeds that have the toxic gene from BT that kills bugs. Those were the only two products on the market here in the United States and globally. They accounted for something like 99% of GMOs in the fields, and both of them were breaking down. Everyone knows about the herbicide resistance problem and the rise of herbicide-resistant weeds. Also, putting tens of millions of acres with the same BT gene made certain insects be able to resist them. This is, speaking of science, this is just straight science. If you hit the same field every year with the same herbicide, the weeds that are in that field are going to evolve resistance. Some portion of them are going to be able to shake off that herbicide. They're going to pass their genes down, and you're going to get herbicide-resistant weeds. And so both Roundup Ready products and BT products began to break down, and there were media articles about them. There began to be all of these articles in popular media talking about these problems of resistance. One of them is right here. Dan Charles of NPR, a very respected journalist, writes this article about how as the BT trait began to break down, there was this surge of insecticides. So farmers were, because certain insects had evolved resistance, farmers were putting on more insecticides than ever, and the same companies selling those BT seeds also sell other insecticides, and they were seeing a boom. In terms of CAFOs, it's the same kind of science. If you put animals together by the thousands and douse them with antibiotics, then bacteria are going to evolve resistance to those antibiotics. And so we started, and meanwhile, the antibiotic regime for humans, for people, was rapidly breaking down. And people were tying that to factory farms. There was all kinds of science coming out about the way that antibiotic-resistant bacteria leaves farms, in water, in air. Flies and cockroaches visit factory farms and take it out. And science was documenting this. It seemed to me that the tide was turning. This is 2013. It seemed to me that that in major media there was this. We were developing this culture of questioning these claims, questioning these tropes, and when you question the dominant, when you ask yourself, is this dominant paradigm killing us? Then you start looking for alternative. And basically, it was this concerted effort and funded effort in the GMO world to change the terms of debate and to stop asking, to make the debate not about what actually existing GMOs were doing, not how they were behaving in the field, not how they were performing, not whether they were breaking down, not whether they were giving rise to gushers of pesticides and herbicides as they failed. The question narrowed to, are they safe to eat? There was a portion of the movement to push back that I think got played because they focused on the food safety issue, and they overplayed research. There is research out there that is, I would say the research is unsettled, and maybe certain GMOs cause trouble when you eat them, but people way overplayed, I think, that research and played into the industry its new sort of paradigm, and the debate became about whether GMOs are safe to eat. And the idea was that if they're safe to eat, then they're fine. What's the problem? If you questioned the paradigm of GMO agriculture, then you were some kind of anti-science zealot. I saw in my own position in the media, it became very, very difficult to maintain my critical stance because suddenly I am being sort of portrayed as someone who's anti-science or who questions science. What we see here is a very, very powerful case study in the way these narratives work. And I can tell you that even in progressive publications, these are very powerful tropes, because no progressive editor, no sort of liberal editor in San Francisco, wants to be seen as someone who's going to starve the poor. If you can say that, GMOs feed the world, and if you're not in favor of GMOs, then you're going to starve the poor, that's going to make that editor pause. And certainly in the incredibly heightened dialogue we have now about climate change with these really insane people in power denying climate change, no progressive editor wants to be seen as anti-science. These articles that I have up here are from 2014, 2015, 2016. Around that time, suddenly the resistance problems, which obviously didn't go anywhere, they continue, these traits in the field continue to unravel. In terms of CAFOs, I should have put more CAFOs in this presentation. There was also this idea that, hey, people in China are gaining income and they're eating more meat, and this is the only way that it can be done, and it's actually better for the environment to put them in. That was going on at the same time. If you just cook your meat, maybe it's got antibiotic-resistant salmonella that could put you in the hospital on it. But hey, if you just cook it and treat it like biohazard, like hazardous material, and sterilize everything, and don't let if you do all that, then you're fine. That was also going on at the same time. It was this sort of pushback, and using the same tropes. So this is scientific agriculture, and if you don't believe in it, then you're anti-science. So extremely, popular with editors. And I did a deep dive into the golden rice question. I think people probably know what it is. It's a rice that's been engineered to contain beta carotene, so it turns golden. And it's trotted out as a solution to vitamin A deficiency in the global south, in countries where rice is a staple. And if you do a deep dive into it and look into it, they're still trying to figure out, to this day, in 2017, how to make it, so they've engineered it to where it contains a big jolt of beta carotene, but they're still trying to figure out how to make a version of it that grows in a way that farmers are used to having it grow, that has decent yields. Because the thing is, the thing about genes is that when you change one thing in a genome, then there's other things that happen too that are triggered, and it ends up being really, really hard to make something like golden rice work, and they still haven't figured it out. And now we're talking about 20 years and billions of dollars of research that could have been put into more sort of appropriate tech means of improving the problem. So you got this big opportunity cost. But that doesn't stop this trope from being, if you question golden rice, then you condemn millions to blindness, even though no golden rice has yet been produced. Like I said before, 99% of GMOs are engineered to withstand herbicide or they contain a pesticide, and that's still true today, and golden rice still doesn't exist. We know that substances that are designed to kill weeds or bugs, they also hurt humans. They also harm humans. I mean, that's just obvious. There's loads and loads of research backing that up. Now we're at the point where we ask, well, how do you push back? And I think that it's extremely important to do two things. And one of them is to reclaim science. There is plenty of science out there about the harms of pesticides. What happens when it goes into our water? What happens when it's on our food and residues? There's even more voluminous literature out there about the harms of CAFOs, about what happens when you produce way more manure than can be absorbed by surrounding land and the way that it leaches out. What happens? I know there's a lot of people in this room now that don't need to see a scientific paper or scientific study that to tell you how awful it is to live near these operations, that they foul the air, they put fine particulate matter in the air that gives you asthma, they make it impossible to enjoy yourself in your own yard, they make you have to close your windows. And not only is that ground truth by people in the room, but there's actual scientific research showing the ill health effects that happen when you live near that stuff. We've got to reclaim science and put it out there that there is overwhelming scientific evidence that pushes back and questions these modes of agriculture. Science is something that comes down from above and presents itself to us, and we sort of bow to it. I think that these narratives have convinced science journalists. And I think one thing that we need to do is talk about the political economy of science. That, like art, if you look at the history of art in Europe, it was shaped by the people that funded it. And science is the same way. You need funding to do science, and the people who fund it can shape the questions that get asked. And if you don't ask hard questions, you don't get answers to questions you don't ask. So there's a lot of power in controlling the questions that get asked. And so we need to make that point, that there's a sociology and a political economy of science. It is important to know and to note if people are on the payroll of Monsanto and that is divulged in scientific studies, but it's not enough. You still have to get in there and engage, and everyone's got to make a living, even scientists. And so even when something is industry funded, you still have to sort of push back on the science. It's not enough to say, oh, it was funded by Monsanto. Don't overplay the shield card. It's important to talk about sources of funding, but it's not the end of the story. And especially here in Iowa, in Des Moines, close to Ames, there's a lot of evil research and stuff that comes out of Ames, a lot of domination of research agenda by these big companies, but there's also fantastic research coming out of Ames, and the scientists that are doing it need to have a platform. They need to be publicized. They need to be engaged with. Matt Liebman, folks know that name? Doing amazing research showing that biodiversity can actually do the work of and replace these chemicals and completely marginalize from the conversation. Richard Cruz, also at ISU, is doing fantastic research on soil erosion and the way that this kind of agriculture is sort of destroying and setting loose and putting into water huge amounts of chemical-enriched soil that's getting into people's water. And so focus on those people, give them a platform. You don't have to do agriculture that way is extremely important. And finally, getting into the communities at the knife's edge of this stuff and telling those stories. These are all things that just as progressive editors are scared to be seen as anti-science or to be wanting to starve people. They're also very interested in stories of people being poisoned by industry, and this is an industry, and pushing back. So publicizing those stories is a very powerful frame. The stuff that is GMO tends to be the crappiest food out there. That avoiding them is
probably a good strategy for healthy eating for the reasons why I just said, that the profitable crops that they've focused on to sort of put under this paradigm are the stuff that you don't want to be eating anyway. The important thing is the food system, what is going out to 300 million Americans, and that is why even if in our own personal choices we need to think about this stuff, it's very important to try to change the system, because the system is fun. If people are getting horrible food as a matter of course, then the system needs to change. We need to fight back. The problem that you have in Iowa is a problem that you have in other states where they have huge concentrations of CAFOs. The problem is that where those companies are really powerful and where they sort of alight and make a lot of profits, they're also extremely politically powerful. Local control, right? So the idea was, can counties make policies that are different from the state policy? And I believe that's an ongoing question here, right? And has local control been achieved in Iowa?
Fireworks. Denied.
Right, and so, I think that is the answer.